This episode is presented to you in the form of an audiobook. Should you change yourself or should you accept yourself as you are? It's a question that can sit in the back of your mind for years because neither answer feels completely right. The reason this question feels so hard to answer is that either choice seems to cost you something important. If you try to accept yourself, it can feel like you're letting yourself off the hook, like you're settling for less than what you could be. If you try to change yourself, it can feel like you're telling yourself you're not good enough as you are. And when both options carry that kind of weight, it's no wonder people get stuck. For example, if you're unhappy with how your career is going, do you push yourself to change roles or industries, or do you accept that this is the kind of work you're best suited for? If your relationship has friction, do you try to change the way you and your partner communicate, or do you accept that certain patterns are just part of the deal? Even with personal habits, maybe your sleep schedule is all over the place. Do you fight to rebuild a perfect routine, or do you accept that your body has a natural rhythm that won't match a rigid plan? The real problem is that most people don't have a clear way to make that decision. They default to whatever feels most urgent in the moment. If they're feeling exhausted of trying, then they lean toward acceptance. They tell themselves, this is just who I am, because change feels too overwhelming or complicated. And if they're feeling dissatisfied with their lives, they swing toward change. They make big plans to overhaul everything about themselves because they're frustrated with their current situation. The problem here is that this back and forth can go on for years without much actually improving because you're stuck on deciding what to change and what to accept about yourself. So what I want to do here is break this question down into something you can think about logically. That doesn't mean removing emotion from the equation because feelings give us important information, but it does mean building a clearer framework so your choice isn't just a reaction to how you feel today. Once you understand what parts of yourself can realistically change, what parts probably won't, and what each decision will actually cost you, it becomes much easier to know when to push for change and when to accept your situation. So, the first thing to understand is that the confusion you feel isn't a sign something is wrong with you. It comes from the way these two ideas, acceptance and change, are usually presented. On paper, they sound like opposites, right? Acceptance says, I'm okay as I am. Change says, I need to be different. But if you take those definitions literally, it feels like you have to pick a side. And once you pick a side, you automatically betray the other. So, if you've ever tried to accept yourself, but still had the urge to improve or change things in your life, you probably felt guilty for not being content. And if you've ever tried to change yourself while still wanting to feel good about who you are right now, you know this is very hard to do because it feels like you're faking it. That tension is exhausting. It makes every decision feel heavier than it should because you're not just deciding what to do, you're questioning what that decision says about who you are. This confusion gets worse because we rarely separate identity from behavior. Identity is the set of traits, values, and patterns that make you feel like yourself. Behavior is what you actually do, your habits, actions, and choices. And when those get tangled, you start protecting unhelpful behaviors because you think they're part of your identity. Or you start trying to rewrite stable parts of your identity because you think they're flaws that can be erased. Either way, your energy is going to the wrong place, and progress slows down or stops entirely. For example, imagine someone who's naturally introverted. If they think being good at networking means becoming an extrovert, they'll waste a lot of energy fighting their temperament. But if they think being introverted means avoiding every professional event, they'll miss opportunities that could help them. Or take someone with perfectionist tendencies. If they treat that as a fixed identity, they might never learn to work faster and let go of small mistakes. But if they try to completely eliminate it, they might lose the attention to detail that makes them valuable. When you treat acceptance and change as opposite camps, you create a false choice. The reality is, they operate on different layers of you. Acceptance belongs to the stable parts of your identity, and change belongs to the flexible parts of your behavior. If you can separate those layers, the contradiction starts to fade. You can respect the foundation of who you are while upgrading the way you operate within it. Now that we've seen how mixing identity and behavior creates the feeling that acceptance and change are in conflict, the next step is learning how to actually separate the two. Because without this step, the theory makes sense, but the choices still feel messy and confusing in real life. As I explained, identity is made up of the traits, values, and long-term tendencies that have shown up consistently over time. These are the patterns that remain relatively stable no matter what environment you're in. Maybe you've always had a certain level of social energy, a particular style of thinking, or a strong preference for routine. These things can evolve slowly, but they don't usually transform overnight, and forcing them to change often leads to frustration. Behavior, on the other hand, is flexible. It's the set of actions, habits, and skills you can deliberately adjust. How you handle a meeting, how often you exercise, whether you initiate conversations, these are all examples of behavior. They're influenced by identity, but they're not identical to it. You can keep your core temperament the same and still develop new habits that expand what you're capable of doing. Again, as I explained, the mistake people make is treating every behavior as if it's part of their identity or treating every part of their identity as if it should be changed. If you protect a habit like procrastination because you tell yourself, that's just how I work, then you're locking yourself into something that could improve with training. If you try to change something like your natural energy rhythm to fit an idealized schedule, then you're setting yourself up for a long, discouraging fight. Here's a practical way to start telling them apart. Ask yourself, has this trait or pattern been consistent for most of my life across different situations, even when I've tried to change it? If yes, it's probably part of your identity. Another question you can ask yourself is, has this improved before when I've made a focused effort? Or does it clearly respond to adjustments in routine or skill building? If yes, it's more likely a behavior. For example, someone might notice they've always needed time alone after intense social interaction. That's an identity trait, but they also notice that their ability to participate in group discussions improves when they prepare talking points in advance. That's a behavior. You can accept the first without fighting it, and you can change the second to make your life easier. The more clearly you can see this divide, the less pressure you feel to completely reinvent yourself just to make progress. Instead, you start thinking in two tracks. Protect what's stable and valuable in your identity, and deliberately adjust behaviors that get in the way of your goals. So, once you can tell the difference between what's part of your identity and what's a behavior, you still have to decide where to invest your effort. Because even if something is technically changeable, that doesn't always mean it's worth changing. You have limited time, energy, and attention. So each project you take on comes with an opportunity cost. Choosing one thing means you're not working on something else. A useful way to approach this is what I call the cost test. It asks 3 questions. How long will it realistically take to see meaningful change? How much ongoing energy will it require to make and maintain that change? And will the payoff be worth the cost, not just in theory, but for your actual life right now? For example, suppose you're uncomfortable speaking in front of groups. Could you change that? Yes, most people can improve public speaking with training and practice, but maybe your current job doesn't require it often, and your goals don't hinge on being great at it. If the payoff is low, you don't gain much, and the cost, like months of practice and a lot of stress, is high, it might make more sense to accept that you're not aiming to be a public speaker right now and direct your energy elsewhere. On the other hand, imagine you have a tendency to let tasks pile up until they become urgent. That's a behavior with a high payoff. If you change it, you get less stress, more control, better results, and you could start improving it within weeks with the right structure. In this case, investing effort into changing this behavior is worth it because the cost is low and the payoff is high. The cost test also applies in relationships. If your partner has a fundamentally different way of processing emotions, and you've seen over years that it doesn't change much, you may need to accept that difference and work around it. Trying to fix it will probably be expensive in terms of conflict and emotional energy, with a low chance of success. But if your partner tends to forget small commitments and you've noticed they improve with reminders and shared calendars, that's worth working on together. It's a behavior that can change with modest effort and clear benefit. So, when you apply the cost test consistently, you stop making these decisions based on mood or frustration. You're no longer jumping into change because you're impatient or retreating into acceptance because you're tired. You're actually weighing the investment like you would with anything else that matters. Over time, this prevents the burnout that comes from chasing unrealistic changes and the regret that comes from avoiding changes you could have made. And once you understand what belongs to acceptance, what belongs to change, and how to decide where to put your effort, the real benefit comes from running both strategies at the same time. Acceptance isn't something you finish and then move on from, and change isn't a one-off project you complete before going back to normal. They work best as parallel processes that reinforce each other. Acceptance gives you stability. It removes the constant background fight with yourself over traits or patterns that aren't going anywhere. For example, if you've accepted that you need more recovery time after intense work days, you stop resenting that fact and start planning for it. That stability frees up mental bandwidth. You're not burning energy wishing things were different, and you can actually relax without feeling guilty for relaxing. And change gives you direction. It takes that freed up energy and channels it into targeted adjustments that improve your daily experience. If you've accepted your natural introversion, you can still work on specific behaviors to make socializing a bit easier. You're not trying to rewrite your temperament. You're just upgrading how you operate within it. The key is to keep both change and acceptance active. People who focus only on change often end up in a permanent state of self-rejection because there's always something left to improve. People who focus only on acceptance can fall into stagnation because they stop challenging themselves even in areas where growth is possible. One practical way to do this is to identify at the start of each month one thing you're actively accepting and one thing you're actively changing. Write them down clearly so you know which is which. For example, you would write, I'm accepting that I do my best creative work late at night, and I'm changing how I manage my calendar so I'm not tired before starting that work. This clarity keeps you from confusing the two and undoing your own progress. Over time, this dual approach builds both resilience because acceptance prevents you from wasting energy on impossible fights, and momentum because change keeps you engaged with improving the parts of life you can influence. When those two are in place, you no longer feel like you have to choose between being kind to yourself and pushing yourself. You can do both, and each one makes the other more effective. That's it for today's episode. Let me know what you guys think. Thanks for listening, take care, and I'll see you next time.